Sushang is a 4-star, but she hits like she's got 5 of them. Maybe it's that massive sword that she swings around, or maybe it's just the illusion of damage that comes from you wanting her to be good. I'm pretty sure she does a lot of damage though, just like how she's pretty sure she understands that text she was reading. Oh, never mind. I love Sushang, and odds are that you do too if you're here, because while there's plenty of hunt characters you could have built, you're here building Chicken Girl. I can't take her seriously, but she takes herself seriously, and that's all that matters. Anyways, today we're building Best Girl, and if you enjoy this type of video, feel free to come hang out on Twitch where we test most of the stuff, and consider subscribing to the channel. With all of that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Sushang. Sushang's kit is super long and wordy like a Yu-Gi-Oh card, but it's actually pretty straightforward. She gets a ton of value from enemies having their weakness broken. More specifically, her talent gives her bonus speed for 2 turns whenever an enemy has their weakness broken. And the amount of speed that she gets is pretty significant, and it affects her build, which we'll get to later. And when she uses her skill, she deals a high multiplier of damage to one single enemy with a 1 in 3 chance to trigger Sword Stance, which deals bonus damage to that enemy. However, if the enemy's weakness is broken, it triggers 100% of the time. Her ultimate is meant to be taken incredibly serious. Just look at that stance.
Nice cock.
She calls upon Phoenix to sit on enemies. Yeah, I don't really know about this one. It deals a pretty big hit of damage on one target and immediately moves her next action forward by 100%. So this basically just means that she gets to attack immediately after her ult. Now, what actually makes Sushang really great is how well she can take advantage of this action forward to deal pretty high single target damage, because she gets an attack boost from her ultimate too, and gets 2 extra chances to trigger Sword Stance for the next 2 turns. So that Sword Stance damage is reduced from the extra chances, but if you're against an enemy that has their weakness broken, you're getting a ridiculous amount of burst from one sequence of turns. Ideally, to get the most damage, you want to use her skill, immediately ult afterwards, and then hopefully if the enemy wasn't weakness broken to begin with, they are now. Then you'll use your skill again and deal a ton of burst damage all at once. Bonus points if you have Bronya to move Sushang up for another skill in that weakness broken window, since you'll be getting maximum damage from Sword Stance in that time. She'll use a ton of skill points, and that's probably her biggest weakness, but that does get fixed with her first Eidolon, which we'll talk about right after this. As for traces, Sushang has a trace that lowers her chances of being hit below 50% HP, which is pretty good since she's not meant to be tanky, but it's more quality of life than anything else. Her second trace is one of her better ones though, since it gives Sword Stance more damage based on how many times Sword Stance has dealt damage during the fight. Her last trace is one of her best, and it moves her action forward by 15% after using her basic attack or skill if any enemy has their weakness broken. Now, what actually makes this insane is that their weakness doesn't even have to be broken by Sushang. It just needs to be broken in general after her attack has been cast, so ideally you'll frequently get free action forward on her if you build your teams around breaking the boss. Chicken Lady is honestly one of my favorite characters in the game, and she's a pretty solid unit for bossing, but she gets even better with Eidolons, so let's talk about those next. Susan can hit pretty hard with the right circumstances, but her Eidolons help her feel a lot better. For example, since she spends so many skill points compared to other damage dealers, her first Eidolon is insane value because it gives back a skill point after using your skill on a weakness broken enemy. Basically, you're getting refunded a ton for bringing optimal teams into different content. It's an amazing Eidolon and absolutely game changing for Sushang. Eidolon 2 makes Sushang tankier for a turn anytime Sword Stance is triggered. And if you're playing Sushang optimally, you'll have this damage reduction almost every single turn, and it's actually more helpful than you might think for surviving those harder hits. 20% is a lot. Eidolon 3 is an ultimate and talent level up, and Eidolon 4 is absolutely huge for Sushang. It increases her break effect by 40%. It's a pretty massive increase in damage from her breaks, and she's able to break pretty often because she has an insatiable bloodlust. Eidolon 5 is a skill and basic attack level up, and Eidolon 6 is a buff to her talent and its speed boost. It allows Sushang's speed boost to stack up to 2 times, and also gives her 1 stack right at the start of battle. Speed boosts on Sushang are welcome because it lets us focus more on her personal damage. Now, if you're in thousands of dollars of student loan debt like I am, then you probably don't have a lot of Sushang Eidolons, but that's okay, right? No. I'm just kidding, it's fine. Her Eidolon 1 is super helpful, but she's pretty playable without the rest of her Eidolons, though they do help her out a fair bit. Not that I think this video is super funny or anything, but I have like an hour left to finish the script and I'm all out of funny juice, so here's the facts. If you've made it to this section, then you're already too lost in the Sushang, and it's time to get back to your... What the fuck did I just say? Relics for Sushang are pretty straightforward. In really early game, before you farm a ton, Thief of Shooting Meteor can be pretty strong for the break effect bonus it gives. As of posting this video, in late game though, I recommend going with the 4-piece boxing set because Sushang will get a ton of attacks quickly due to how her ultimate works. The 4-piece gives a 5% attack bonus, stacking up to 5 times whenever the user attacks or is hit, so you'll get 25% attack bonus quickly and also 10% physical damage bonus. Alternatively though, if you don't want to farm for a new set, you can always mix 2-piece sets of something like Wild Wheat and the boxing set, or if you have good stats, you can go with 4-piece Wild Wheat. 4-piece Wild Wheat doesn't really get a ton of value on Sushang because she doesn't ever really use her basic attack, and she doesn't really need a ton of speed since she has some built in. But with that said, it's decent. Lastly, if you're playing her with Silverwolf or into quantum weak enemies, Genius of Brilliant Stars can be an okay shoe-in, since I know you farmed a set for Seela and you don't have any other good relics yet. And then as far as main stats go, my recommendation is to go with a crit rate or damage body, just based on whatever you need more of to get a balance of at least 50 crit rate and 100 crit damage. More is better, but you want at least 50 100 minimum. For boots though, I actually recommend attack boots over speed because Sushang has a talent that gives her enough of a speed increase to activate certain planar sets, and she also has a lot of action forward in her kit, so in my opinion, speed is just not super necessary on her. But with that said, it is an option. For her sphere, you're going to want to give her physical damage to synergize with your emotional damage, and for your rope, it's a toss-up between energy recharge, attack percent, and break effect. Technically speaking, if you can get Sushang's ult up in 3 turns with an energy regen rope, it ends up being more damage than attack percent because more ults means more extra skills. You need to get knockouts against enemies to make this work in the first place, or have a ton of energy from other sources, but if you're feeling confident in your star rail and content knowledge, then energy regen rope is technically gonna be better. But for most players, attack percent is gonna be the most consistent, and in some scenarios, break effect can also be better, specifically if you don't already have E4 and you're breaking a ton of enemies. In my opinion, I would recommend attack percent if you have E0 Sushang, attack percent or energy regen at Eidolon 1, and between those two, just the one with the better substats is gonna be better. And then if you're really early on so you don't have a ton of stats, or if you're in endgame content and really trying to optimize, break effect can be decent as well. It's all pretty situational. Now, speaking of substats, Sushang loves crit stats, attack percent, break effect, and speed. So if you see pieces with that is what you're looking for. For your planar set, generally Space Sealing Station and Inert Salsotto are pretty good options. I don't really remember what this new set is called because it's not on my screen right now, but if you're a hyper-invested Sushang that can meet the requirements to get the set bonus, it's a pretty solid option, especially because you're going to be using skill on Sushang so much. As a couple extra set options, Kingdom of Banditry can be solid if you're running speed boots on Sushang, and lastly, if you want to be extra safe with your energy regen rope on Sushang, you can use Sprightly, but I don't super recommend it. Now here's a build summary just to wrap everything up. I recommend a crit body, attack boots, physical damage sphere, and your choice of rope, but if you want the most straightforward option, go with attack percent. For sets, 4-piece boxing is going to be a top pick, but you can mix 2-piece sets if need be, and for planers, Space Sealing Station, Inert Salsotto, and Rudolent Arena, that's what it's called, I just remembered, are all pretty solid options if you can activate them, which you should be able to at the very least activate Space Sealing Station and Inert Salsotto. Dude, I can't wait to play Sushang again. I'm so tired of recording. The very next step to leveling up your Susan is to give her a good light cone. So let's talk about which ones are best, and I have a little ranking for you guys. If you are a free-to-play player, you already know it's good. I don't even need to tell you. The free 5-star from Herta's shop, Cruising on the Stellar Sea, is going to be a top pick for Sushang, especially if you don't have Gacha light cones. It's not Sushang's best in slot, but it is really solid, and you'll want to use it if you don't have any other 5-star light cones or swordplay at a high superimposition. Speaking of which, if you have solid crit stats, swordplay at S5 is a top pick for Sushang, and following that in the night at S1 is amazing. Many stat bonuses. Sleep Like the Dead is also pretty solid for its own stat bonuses as well, and Only Silence Remains is a decent option for Sushang and honestly all hunt characters, because when you get to a boss wave, you'll get the full effect of the light cone. The Battle Pass light cone Return to Darkness is a good stat stick in general and can be amazing in very specific content that requires you to remove buffs from enemies. Though it's kind of inconsistent, I really like it. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more. The light cone is pretty good, but you should subscribe to my YouTube channel. We're almost at 200k subscribers. We are really close actually. I'd very much appreciate it if you hit the button down below. Now, if you want want the specifics for weapons, here's a chart showing simulated damage differences and a weapon ranking. Keep in mind that this is from simulation, so there could be some minor differences in rankings in practicality or depending on your specific scenario, but this is generally okay to reference for which light cones to prioritize for Sushang. Next up, I want to talk about Sushang synergies and what you can do to get the most out of Best Girl. While we don't have a ton of characters on the roster yet, there's still quite a few characters that can work well with Best Girl. So real quick, I want to go over some of her better partners, and hopefully it'll help you craft some teams for her. So one thing to know about Sushang is that she uses up her turns very, very quickly. This is something that you'll notice, especially if you pair her with someone like Tingyun, because Tingyun goes well with any hyper carry unit. You basically just buff them. They get a ton of bonus attack, and then they get their damage bonus from her ultimate and stuff. Like, she gives a lot of buffs, right? The thing is, her skill lasts for 3 turns, and if you give that to Sushang and you use her skill and then her ultimate, then her skill again, that's 2 turns immediately used up. And granted, you are getting all of that damage out of her, but it means that Tingyun's going to have to use her skill more frequently because Sushang is taking up more turns. And if you don't have her at Eidolon 1, that can get a little bit pricey for your skill points. So what I actually recommend doing is, you can't always play her with attack buffs, but what I found to work out extraordinarily well with her is running her with debuffers, like Silverwolf, for example, because when you apply debuff to an enemy, that's based on the enemy's turns. And so it doesn't matter how many turns Sushang gets in between the enemy's turn, especially if you're going to be breaking enemies and delaying them a little bit further anyways. Sushang can get a lot of value out of defense shred. You don't necessarily need to run Pela and Silverwolf together, but just these 2 characters as an example, characters that debuff enemies, can be very, very useful with Sushang. And I highly recommend this team that has Silverwolf in it. This is one of my favorites for Sushang. Sushang, Silverwolf, Natasha, and Clara. Now, when Fushuan comes out, it's possible we could replace Natasha with Fushuan, but in this case, it would be a little awkward because Clara wants to take the damage. And honestly, I haven't really looked at anything Fushuan related because there's nothing that's been officially released. So for now, this, in my opinion, is one of the better versions of this team. And if you're playing into content that has other weaknesses already, like if there is someone with like a lightning weakness and you wanted to throw Tingyun in here to have a debuffer and have a buffer, you could do this if the enemy already has lightning weakness. So that way Silverwolf either implants the quantum or implants the physical. Also, Silverwolf enables you to run this set, which I threw on her because I don't have any good relics in this video game. So I've been using this set with Silverwolf and enemies that have quantum on them. This is actually like pretty solid just because of the defense ignore. But anyways, I really like this setup. I think this is a lot of fun. But there's a couple more synergies with Sushang that I do want to talk about. So let's say you have good old Susan, good old Sussy Shang, good old Sushusi. She's right there, and look how proud she is. Look at her stance. There's a character that was recently released named Yukong. There was a character named Yukong. So Yukong has this ability that basically buffs you for the next 2 turns. Now there's a good and bad thing about this. So I'm gonna go over the in theory what works and the not in theory what works. So basically, if you speed tune Yukong to be right in front of Sushang, what you can do is you can Yukong and then you can Sushang skill, ult, and skill again, and Sushang will get both uses of Yukong's buff, meaning that her buff is actually just a lot more effective because it's going straight to your damage dealer. But the problem with this is that Sushang has so many different action forwards and speed changes that speed tuning Yukong to Sushang is actually very difficult, and I wouldn't say it's super practical. This is just one of those things that it can align once or twice per fight and can bring a lot of value to you. So I would say that Yukong in theory has really good synergy with Sushang, but in practicality may not be as useful as you would like it to be, but it's worth noting. Now, I mentioned attack buffers with turn limits earlier. That was Tingyun primarily. If you use someone like Asta, you don't really have to worry about Sushang taking a bunch of extra turns because Asta's attack buff just kind of passively exists with the amount of charge stacks that she has. And so if you use Asta and Sushang together, you can keep up the attack buff from Asta on Sushang basically the entire time. The downside of this is that Sushang's very skill point heavy, and if you don't have Eidolon 1 for Sushang, this synergy won't actually work as well because Asta's going to want to use a lot of your skill points to keep up the attack buff against multiple enemies anyways. But this is another synergy that I personally really like. Now, Sushang can be paired with Bronya and can be very good. The thing to know about this is that it is, again, very skill point heavy if you don't have Eidolon 1 Sushang. If you have Eidolon 0 Sushang, you're going to use a skill point, then you're going to use an ultimate, and then you're going to use a skill point again. That's 2 skill points down, and then you're going to use Bronya's skill to bring Sushang up, and then you're going to use another skill point on Sushang. So that's going to be 4 skill points in a row to get Bronya's buff on Sushang and also get her normal combo off if you don't have E1. Without Bronya, you're basically only getting 2 of those attacks, and it ends up being fine. But granted, like, you know, Bronya's such a good unit that she basically enhances every team. It's just something to think about. So one kind of cool thing about Sushang that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about is just for like kind of general content in the game is running her with Himiko. I don't have Himiko on this account. Serval is Himiko now. Himiko's talent triggers whenever enemies get hit with weakness break. Now, if you know anything about Sushang, she inflicts a lot of weakness break. break. She has very strong weakness break on her skill, and then she has her ultimate, and she has her skill again. So she's gonna be able to break enemies very quickly and very consistently. And if you combine her with someone like our totally real Himiko here, you're gonna actually be able to activate Himiko's talent pretty frequently, which means that Himiko might see higher damage and honestly just be slightly better unit to pair up with Sushang. Granted, this is all basically feels crafting, and I tried this on my other account and it felt kind of fine, but depending on the content, that could actually just be useless, and you know, we're just out here doing our best to make best girl feel good to play. Last character I want to talk about is Welt. Welt can slow down enemies being slow. Sushang go fast, zoom zoom, bang bang, hit them with the chicken. Rise, Phoenix! Anyways, that's basically the entire roster that we have right now. Those are your main synergy with Sushang, and you can kind of build your teams around that based on the weaknesses that enemies have and the elements that you need. But I personally, right now, my favorite team is this one. So Sushang is actually a character that I think is fairly underrated just because some of the 5-stars we've seen have been absolutely insane damage dealers. So she's kind of been left out to dry, but I do think she's actually pretty solid. And also she's literally the cutest character in the entire game, and I don't want to hear anyone argue with me about that. Nope, not even you. Subscribe for more!